The pervasive narrative surrounding aging and joint health has long been dominated by a profound misconception, one that dictates the inevitable and irreversible decline of structural integrity, particularly within the complex biomechanical architecture of the knee. For generations, the medical establishment and mainstream fitness paradigms have perpetuated the belief that the gradual onset of stiffness, the agonizing reduction in range of motion, and the chronic accumulation of metabolic waste within the joint capsule are permanent fixtures of the human aging process. This fatalistic perspective has condemned millions of older adults to a life of progressive immobility, tethering their psychological well-being to a declining physical vessel and robbing them of their structural independence. However, emerging biomechanical research juxtaposed with the physiological mechanisms of traditional, ancient kinematic practices offers a revolutionary paradigm shift. We categorically debunk the entrenched myth of permanent joint stiffness by illuminating the profound efficacy of a highly specific, traditional seated stretching protocol designed to physiologically isolate the tibial and patellar tendons. Through an exhaustive examination of biomechanics, cellular signaling, and metabolic clearance, it becomes undeniably clear that the key to restoring youthful elasticity to the aging knee lies not in highly invasive medical interventions, but in the precise application of sustained mechanical tension. This traditional seated technique, rooted in antiquity yet fundamentally validated by contemporary orthopedic science, operates on a mechanism of targeted static holding that directly facilitates the complete washout of synovial fluid and the definitive eradication of deeply embedded lactic acid. To truly comprehend the transformative power of this isolated stretching methodology, one must first dismantle the physiological architecture of the knee joint and understand the insidious nature of metabolic degradation that occurs as we age. The human knee is an evolutionary marvel, a highly sophisticated hinge joint that bears the brunt of our bipedal existence, relying heavily on the synergistic interplay between the quadriceps femoris muscle group, the patellar tendon, the patella itself, and the tibial tuberosity. As individuals traverse through the decades of life, a confluence of sedentary behaviors, suboptimal nutritional profiles, and chronic microtraumas leads to a phenomenon known as physiological gridlock within the dense connective tissues of the lower extremities. The primary culprit in this localized degradation is the unchecked accumulation of lactic acid, a metabolic byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis that, under optimal physiological conditions, is efficiently cleared by the circulatory system. However, in the aging adult, the microcapillary networks surrounding the facial envelopes of the knee become compromised, leading to regions of localized ischemia and hypoxia. In these oxygen-deprived environments, lactic acid ceases to be a transient metabolite and instead transforms into a persistent chemical irritant, significantly lowering the intracellular and extracellular pH. This acidic microenvironment directly stimulates nociceptors, the sensory neurons responsible for transmitting pain signals to the central nervous system, thereby creating a chronic sensation of aching and stiffness that the elderly uniquely experience. Furthermore, this prolonged acidification actively degrades the extracellular matrix, compromising the delicate cross-linking of collagen fibers within the patellar and tibial tendons and fundamentally stripping the tissues of their inherent viscoelasticity. The conventional response to this localized acidosis and subsequent stiffness has often involved dynamic movements or low-impact cardiovascular exercises, which, while beneficial for systemic cardiovascular health, utterly fail to penetrate the deep, avascular structures of the tendons to initiate meaningful metabolic clearance. This is precisely where the profound brilliance of the traditional seated static hold becomes evident, as it bypasses the limitations of dynamic movement by leveraging the power of sustained mechanical tension to force a dramatic physiological reset within the joint capsule. When an individual engages in this highly specific seated protocol, they intentionally position their biomechanical levers to isolate the precise vector of tension running from the inferior pole of the patella down to the tibial tuberosity. This isolation is absolutely critical. Unlike generalized leg stretches that dissipate mechanical force across the hamstrings, calves, and gluteal muscles, this technique hyperfocuses the tensile load exclusively onto the patellar and tibial tendinous structures. By holding this exact biomechanical angle in a state of unwavering static tension, the practitioner initiates a profound sequence of biological events known as mechanotransduction, the fundamental process by which mechanical stimuli are converted into complex biochemical cellular responses. As the static hold is maintained over a prolonged duration, typically exceeding the conventional 30-second recommendation to reach a threshold of deep facial yielding, the continuous tensile load acts as a powerful mechanical pump. This sustained pressure dramatically alters the hydrostatic dynamics within the joint capsule and the surrounding tendon sheaths, effectively wringing out the dense connective tissues much like a saturated sponge. This is the mechanism of synovial fluid washout, a highly dynamic biological process where the old, degraded, and metabolically toxic synovial fluid, laden with high concentrations of stagnant lactic acid and inflammatory cytokines, is forcibly expelled from the articular and periarticular spaces. Synovial fluid is the lifeblood of the avascular cartilage and tendons, a viscous substance primarily composed of hyaluronic acid and lubricin, which relies entirely on mechanical movement and pressure differentials to circulate. In the chronically stiff, aging knee, this fluid becomes highly viscous and trapped, turning into a toxic reservoir that accelerates tissue degradation. The sustained mechanical tension of a seated stretch forcibly collapses the micropockets of trapped fluid within the joint architecture, driving the acidic, lactic acid-rich plasma out of the local tissue environment and into the lymphatic system for ultimate systemic clearance. Simultaneously, as the stretch is slowly released, a massive influx of fresh, highly oxygenated blood and newly synthesized synovial fluid rushes back into the joint space, a phenomenon known as reactive hyperemia. This fresh fluid is rich in essential nutrients, oxygen, and macromolecules required for immediate cellular repair, effectively neutralizing the acidic microenvironment and restoring an optimal physiological pH. This dramatic shift from a state of metabolic toxicity to one of intense nourishment is the foundational requirement for cellular regeneration, allowing the resident fibroblasts, the specialized cells responsible for synthesizing collagen and extracellular matrix, to transition out of a dormant, defensive state and begin the rigorous process of structural rebuilding. To fully grasp the magnitude of this cellular remodeling, it is necessary to delve into the precise microanatomy of the tendon itself and the concept of collagen elasticity. In a youthful, healthy knee, the type 1 collagen fibers that comprise the bulk of the patellar and tibial tendons are arranged in a highly organized, undulating pattern known as collagen crimp. This microscopic wave-like structure acts as a biological shock absorber, allowing the tendon to stretch and recoil with tremendous efficiency, thereby absorbing the immense impact forces of walking, climbing stairs, and standing. However, the aging process, exacerbated by the chronic presence of lactic acid and the absence of targeted tensile loading, causes these once wavy fibers to become abnormally cross-linked, fibrotic, and rigidly straight. The loss of this collagen crimp is the anatomical reality behind the sensation of permanent stiffness. The tendon literally loses its physical capacity to store and release elastic energy. The profound genius of the isolated seated static hold is that it specifically targets this pathological cross-linking. When the targeted mechanical tension is applied over an extended period, the force begins to systematically break down the abnormal, pathological adhesions between the collagen fibers, a process that cannot be achieved through short, dynamic, or bouncing movements. The prolonged nature of the hold is essential because connective tissue exhibits viscoelastic properties, specifically a phenomenon known as creep. Creep refers to the progressive deformation and lengthening of a tissue under a constant, unwavering load over time. By forcing the patellar and tibial tendons into a state of physiological creep, The traditional stretching protocol elongates the fibrotic tissues past their pathological resting state, signaling the fibroblasts to dismantle the stiff, disorganized collagen bundles and lay down fresh, parallel fibers that reestablish the youthful crimp pattern. Over time, and with consistent practice, this process literally reconstructs the microscopic architecture of the tendon, restoring its inherent elasticity and transforming the joint from a rigid, painful hinge into a fluid, resilient mechanism. This restoration of youthful elasticity is not merely a structural triumph. It is a profound biological victory that guarantees structural independence for the elderly individual. The concept of structural independence is arguably the most critical metric of gerontological health, defining an older adult's ability to navigate their physical environment without reliance on external aids, caregivers, or debilitating pharmacological pain management. When a knee joint is liberated from the shackles of lactic acid accumulation and fibrotic stiffness, the entire kinetic chain of the human body experiences a dramatic functional upgrade. The ability to rise from a chair, descend a flight of stairs, or walk across uneven terrain without the agonizing hesitation that accompanies chronic knee pain fundamentally alters the trajectory of the aging experience. However, the efficacy of this ancient, scientifically validated mechanical intervention is profoundly multiplied when it is strategically integrated with a deep understanding of nutritional biochemistry, systemic physiology, and psychological resilience. From a nutritional standpoint, the cellular remodeling initiated by the mechanotransduction of the seated stretch demands a hyperspecific substrate availability. The fibroblasts frantically working to rebuild the collagen crimp pattern require vast quantities of specific amino acids, primarily glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline, which form the triple helix structure of the collagen molecule. The diets of many older adults are notoriously deficient in these specific amino acids, often due to a reduced intake of connective tissue-rich meats and an overall decline in digestive efficiency. Therefore, for the synovial washout and collagen remodeling processes to reach their absolute maximum potential, systemic nutritional support is non-negotiable. Furthermore, the enzymatic conversion of proline to hydroxyproline, a crucial step in stabilizing the collagen molecule, is entirely dependent on the presence of ascorbic acid or vitamin C. Without adequate cellular concentrations of vitamin C, the newly synthesized collagen fibers will remain weak and structurally incompetent, rendering the mechanical benefits of the stretch practically void. Thus, an integrated protocol demands the synergistic application of mechanical tension alongside robust dietary interventions to provide the raw materials necessary for true physiological rejuvenation. Beyond the building blocks of collagen, the management of systemic inflammation through dietary fatty acids plays a pivotal role in the microenvironment of the aging knee. The accumulation of lactic acid discussed earlier is deeply intertwined with chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation, often driven by a disproportionate ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in a modern diet. By saturating the cellular membranes with highly anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acids, specifically icosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, the practitioner effectively lowers the baseline inflammatory tone of the entire joint capsule. This reduction in systemic inflammation drastically improves the rheological properties of the synovial fluid, making it less viscous and more conducive to the washout process initiated by the seated static hold. Furthermore, adequate hydration cannot be overstated. Water is the primary solvent in the synovial fluid, and even mild states of chronic dehydration, which are alarmingly common in the elderly population, can severely impede the hydrodynamic lubrication of the joint surfaces and stall the clearance of metabolic waste. Integrating this specific stretching technique into a broader context of lifestyle medicine further amplifies its restorative power. The physiological repair mechanisms triggered by the isolation of the tibial and patellar tendons do not occur instantaneously during the stretch itself. Rather, the mechanical tension acts as a signaling mechanism, while the actual structural rebuilding occurs almost entirely during the deep stages of sleep. During the slow-wave phases of the sleep cycle, the anterior pituitary gland secretes pulses of human growth hormone, a systemic endocrine signal that directs the liver to produce insulin-like growth factor. This hormonal cascade is the master switch for cellular repair, drastically accelerating the fibroblast activity required to rebuild the tendon matrix and clear away the residual damage caused by chronic lactic acid pooling. Consequently, if the application of the seated stretch is decoupled from rigorous sleep hygiene, the biological response will be severely blunted. Circadian rhythm alignment, minimizing exposure to artificial blue light in the evening and ensuring an optimal sleep environment, are therefore just as critical to restoring joint elasticity as the mechanical technique itself. Moreover, the psychological dimensions of chronic knee stiffness and its subsequent resolution present a fascinating and deeply moving area of clinical observation. The phenomenon of kinesiophobia, defined as an excessive, irrational, and debilitating fear of physical movement resulting from a feeling of vulnerability to painful injury, is a massive psychological barrier for the aging population. When an individual has lived with severe, localized knee stiffness for years, their central nervous system essentially rewires itself to perceive even normal, benign ranges of motion as threatening. This neuroplastic adaptation creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of decay. The fear of pain leads to profound immobility, which exacerbates the pooling of lactic acid and the fibrotic stiffening of the tendons, which in turn causes more pain and reinforces the phobia. The profound beauty of the isolated, seated static stretch lies in its ability to safely bypass this neurological alarm system. Because the technique is performed in a completely supported, seated position, removing the unpredictable variables of balance and load-bearing, the central nervous system perceives the movement as safe. As the practitioner gently but firmly applies the static tension, overriding the myotatic stretch reflex through patience and sustained pressure, the Golgi tendon organs within the patellar tendon send inhibitory signals to the quadriceps, forcing the surrounding musculature to deeply relax. This profound neuromuscular relaxation not only facilitates the physical yielding of the connective tissue, but also sends powerful safety signals back to the brain, fundamentally dismantling the neural circuits of kinesiophobia. As the individual experiences the profound relief of the synovial washout and the subsequent return of elasticity, a dramatic psychological transformation occurs. The realization that their structural decline is not a permanent, inevitable sentence, but rather a reversible physiological state, ignites a powerful sense of self-efficacy and hope. This psychological liberation is intricately linked to the concept of structural independence. As the knee regains its youthful mechanics, the individual reclaims their agency in the world, leading to profound improvements in mood, cognitive engagement, and overall quality of life. The psychological buoyancy that accompanies the return of physical autonomy triggers a positive feedback loop, encouraging the individual to engage in further health-promoting behaviors, thereby compounding the benefits of the initial intervention. The intricacies of the extracellular matrix within the patellar tendon deserve an even deeper exploration to truly comprehend why the seated static hold is so uniquely effective compared to virtually all other forms of rehabilitative exercise. The extracellular matrix is not a mere passive scaffolding. It is a highly dynamic, electrically charged, and metabolically active environment that dictates the absolute health and functionality of the resident cells. Within this matrix, proteoglycans play a stellar role. These heavily glycosylated proteins are highly hydrophilic, meaning they attract and bind enormous amounts of water. In a youthful, highly elastic tendon, a rich concentration of specific proteoglycans, particularly decorin and biglycan, ensures that the collagen fibrils are bathed in a superhydrated gel. This hydration is precisely what allows the collagen fibers to slide past one another with frictionless grace during human movement. However, the chronic pooling of lactic acid, brought about by age-related circulatory decline and the profound lack of targeted mechanical pumping, creates a localized state of acidosis that directly attacks this delicate biochemical balance. In an acidic environment, the enzymatic degradation of these vital proteoglycans drastically accelerates. Matrix metalloproteinases, a class of enzymes responsible for tissue remodeling, become pathologically hyperactive in the presence of continuous acidic stress and inflammatory cytokines. These enzymes literally chew up the proteoglycans, rapidly degrading the tendon's ability to hold water. As the tendon desiccates, the collagen fibers draw intimately closer together, and abnormal, pathological crosslinks begin to form between them. These are not the healthy, purposeful crosslinks facilitated by vitamin C during new collagen synthesis. Rather, these are advanced glycation end products and random, disorganized bonds that glue the collagen fibers into a rigid, non-yielding mass. This desiccation and pathological cross-linking are the microscopic reality of the stiffness that elderly individuals feel every single morning upon waking. When the practitioner initiates the traditional seated static stretch, they are engaging in an act of profound biochemical intervention. As the tension is slowly and methodically applied to the isolated tibial and patellar tendons, the mechanical force physically pulls these glued fibers apart. But more importantly, the sustained nature of the static hold creates a profound piezoelectric effect within the tissue. Because collagen is a piezoelectric material, mechanical deformation generates tiny electrical currents throughout the matrix. These electrical signals are immediately detected by the fibroblasts, which interpret them as a desperate demand for structural reinforcement and rehydration. The fibroblasts instantly upregulate their gene expression for proteoglycan synthesis. Simultaneously, the synovial washout phenomenon previously detailed forcefully flushes away the excess matrix metalloproteinases and the stagnant lactic acid, neutralizing the pH of the microenvironment. With the acidic threat removed and the electrical signaling commanding new growth, the fibroblasts secrete massive amounts of new decorin and biglycan into the extracellular space. As the static hold is eventually released and the reactive hyperemia floods the area with fresh blood and fluid, these newly synthesized proteoglycans eagerly bind to the incoming water. This rapid rehydration of the matrix physically forces the collagen fibrils apart, restoring the critical sliding mechanism and immediately reducing the sensation of stiffness. This process is further optimized when we consider the vital role of the facial continuum. The patellar tendon does not exist in an anatomical vacuum. It is the ultimate convergence point of the entire facial envelope of the anterior thigh. The deep fascia of the quadriceps, specifically the fascia lata, seamlessly blends into the retinacular fibers of the knee capsule and the patellar tendon itself. In the aging adult, chronic immobility causes this facial web to become densified and highly restrictive, acting like a rigid straitjacket that severely limits the excursion of the patella during movement. This patellar restriction dramatically increases the compressive forces on the articular cartilage behind the kneecap, leading to chondromalacia and the painful, grinding sensation often described by the elderly. The seated static protocol, by enforcing a specific biomechanical geometry, not only targets the tendon, but also fundamentally reorganizes this restrictive facial web. As the static hold exceeds the 2-minute mark, the mechanical tension propagates upward through the myofascial expansions, triggering a phenomenon known as facial unwinding. The ground substance of the fascia, which transitions from a fluid state to a solid, glue-like state in the absence of movement, begins to undergo a thixotropic change. Under the sustained mechanical stress and the slight localized heat generated by the tension, the dense, gel-like ground substance literally melts back into a highly fluid state. This thixotropic melting releases the restrictive facial adhesions that have tethered the patella, restoring its natural, frictionless tracking within the trochlear groove of the femur. The elimination of this compressive restriction provides immediate, profound relief to the underlying articular cartilage, allowing it to decompress and imbibe fresh synovial fluid. It is this multi-tiered approach, simultaneously resolving tendinous desiccation, eradicating lactic acid, and reversing facial densification, that elevates this specific stretching protocol from a simple physical exercise to a masterfully orchestrated physiological reset. To fully harness this profound biological cascade, one must deeply respect the intricacies of the nervous system's response to stretching. Many well-intentioned individuals fail to achieve these remarkable results because they approach the stretch aggressively, treating their tight knees as mechanical objects to be forcefully pried open. This aggressive, high-velocity approach instantly triggers the myotatic reflex, a spinal reflex designed to protect muscles and tendons from sudden tearing. When the muscle spindles embedded within the quadriceps detect a rapid change in length, they instantly fire an excitatory signal to the spinal cord, which immediately commands the quadriceps to forcefully contract. Trying to stretch a maximally contracted muscle is not only biomechanically futile, but also highly dangerous, often leading to micro-tearing and a subsequent increase in inflammatory pain and stiffness. The traditional methodology inherently avoids this catastrophic error by demanding extreme slowness and conscious relaxation. By entering the stretch position at a nearly imperceptible speed and utilizing deep, diaphragmatic breathing to modulate the autonomic nervous system, the practitioner successfully sneaks past the radar of the myotatic reflex. As the static position is held, the sensory focus shifts to the Golgi tendon organs, which are mechanoreceptors located precisely at the musculotendinous junctions. Unlike the muscle spindles, which respond to rapid changes in length, the Golgi tendon organs respond to sustained, heavy tension. After a prolonged period of continuous load, typically around 30 to 60 seconds, these organs initiate the autogenic inhibition reflex. They fire an overwhelming inhibitory signal directly to the motor neurons supplying the quadriceps muscle, commanding it to completely and utterly relax. It is only in this state of profound, neurologically mandated relaxation that the true elongation of the dense tendinous and facial tissues can occur. The individual will literally feel a physical yielding sensation within the joint as the neurological resistance evaporates and the mechanical tension finally transfers completely into the extracellular matrix. This neurological interplay is profoundly influenced by the practitioner's psychological state. If the elderly individual approaches the protocol with anxiety, fear of pain, or a generalized state of high systemic stress, their sympathetic nervous system will be chronically hyperactive. A hyperactive sympathetic state inherently increases baseline muscle tone, making the threshold for the protective myotatic reflex extremely low and the required duration for Golgi tendon organ inhibition excruciatingly long. Therefore, the integration of parasympathetic downregulation techniques, such as extended exhalations and mindfulness practices prior to and during the stretch, is not merely a holistic add-on, but a rigorous physiological necessity for optimizing the mechanical outcome. This profound intersection of mind, neurology, and biomechanics underscores the majestic complexity of human healing. As we venture further into the systemic variables that dictate the success of this joint restoration protocol, the role of metabolic health and blood glucose regulation emerges as a silent yet immensely powerful dictator of tissue elasticity. The epidemic of insulin resistance and chronically elevated blood sugar levels among the aging population has devastating consequences for the structural integrity of the knee. When blood glucose concentrations remain perpetually high, the excess sugar molecules haphazardly attach themselves to proteins throughout the body in a non-enzymatic process called glycation. As previously mentioned, these sugar-protein amalgams form advanced glycation end products. The collagen within the patellar and tibial tendons, due to its exceptionally slow turnover rate, is highly susceptible to massive glycation accumulation over the decades. These advanced glycation end products essentially act as a biochemical superglue, cross-linking the adjacent collagen fibers so aggressively that they completely lose their ability to slide, devastating the vital crimp pattern. Furthermore, these products bind to specific cellular receptors located on the surface of macrophages and fibroblasts within a joint capsule. The activation of these receptors triggers a massive, localized inflammatory cascade, flooding the synovial environment with destructive cytokines. This biochemical firestorm not only amplifies the sensation of pain, but also completely paralyzes the synthetic capabilities of the fibroblasts, rendering them incapable of rebuilding the tendon matrix regardless of how perfectly the mechanical stretch is applied. Therefore, relying solely on the mechanical intervention without addressing a highly toxic, hyperglycemic internal environment is akin to attempting to rebuild a burning house. To truly unlock the regenerative potential of the seated stretching protocol, it is absolutely imperative to orchestrate a systemic metabolic environment that minimizes glycation formation and suppresses systemic inflammation. This necessitates a rigorous dietary paradigm that prioritizes glycemic control, emphasizing the consumption of low-glycemic, nutrient-dense whole foods while aggressively eliminating refined carbohydrates and processed sugars. By maintaining steady, low blood insulin and glucose levels, the individual dramatically halts the ongoing cross-linking of their collagen, effectively stopping the active progression of stiffness. Moreover, the strategic implementation of intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding can profoundly augment this process by inducing a state of systemic autophagy. Autophagy is the body's highly conserved cellular recycling program, wherein highly specialized enzymes literally scour the tissues, identifying, dismantling, and removing damaged, misfolded proteins and pathological crosslinks, including the insidious glycation products. By combining the powerful, targeted mechanical tension of the seated stretch, which breaks the physical adhesions on a macro level, with the deep cellular house cleaning of fasting-induced autophagy, which dismantles the chemical glues on a molecular level, the practitioner unleashes an unparalleled dual-force intervention that completely eradicates the foundations of age-related joint stiffness. The clearance of these stubborn metabolic byproducts via autophagy ensures that when the reactive hyperemia rushes fresh blood into the knee post-stretch, the local environment is pristine, receptive, and fully primed for high-quality, uncorrupted collagen synthesis. To further support this highly orchestrated cellular reconstruction, we must deeply analyze the role of specific micronutrients beyond just vitamin C. Zinc and copper, for instance, are critical cofactors for the enzyme lysyl oxidase. This enzyme is solely responsible for creating the healthy, highly organized, and purposeful crosslinks that give newly synthesized collagen its immense tensile strength. If an aging individual embarks on this rigorous stretching protocol but remains deeply deficient in zinc and copper, a profoundly common reality due to declining gastric acid production and poor dietary diversity, the fibroblasts will frantically synthesize new collagen in response to the mechanical signaling. But this new collagen will remain weak, disorganized, and completely devoid of structural integrity. Consequently, the newly gained range of motion will be highly unstable, leading to an increased risk of injury and a rapid regression back into chronic stiffness. This highlights the absolute necessity of a comprehensive, integrative perspective. Mechanical therapies, no matter how ancient, specific, or scientifically validated, are inextricably tethered to the biochemical realities of the host organism. Providing the exact enzymatic cofactors required for tissue maturation is just as critical as the mechanical application of tension itself. Let us pivot our focus toward the complex hemodynamics and the microvascular architecture that dictates the survival and repair of the knee joint. The tendons and ligaments of the knee are notoriously avascular, meaning they possess a remarkably poor direct blood supply compared to muscle tissue. This inherent evolutionary design is precisely what makes them so resilient to incredible tensile forces, as excessive blood vessels within a highly loaded tendon would be instantly crushed. However, This lack of vascularity becomes a severe liability when the tissue is damaged, suffocated by lactic acid, and desperately in need of oxygen and nutrients. The cells residing within the deep core of the patellar tendon rely almost entirely on the diffusion of nutrients from the surrounding synovial fluid and the highly vascularized peritendon, the loose connective tissue sheath that tightly envelopes the tendon. As we age, and as sedentary behaviors dominate our daily existence, the capillary beds within this crucial peritendon begin to atrophy and regress in a process known as capillary rarefaction. This microvascular die-off drastically increases the distance over which vital nutrients must diffuse to reach the struggling fibroblasts in the core of the tendon, effectively starving them into a state of cellular senescence. The traditional seated stretching protocol actively combats this ischemic decline through a fascinating hemodynamic mechanism known as the muscle pump effect, combined with localized pressure differentials. During the intense, sustained static hold, the immense pressure within the knee capsule and the tight facial wrapping physically collapses the remaining capillary beds, momentarily inducing a state of deep, localized ischemia. The tissues become completely starved of oxygen for the duration of the stretch. While this might sound detrimental, it is, in fact, a powerful hormetic stressor. In response to this acute, transient hypoxia, the endothelial cells lining the blood vessels desperately release massive amounts of nitric oxide and vascular endothelial growth factor. Nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator, forcefully relaxing the smooth muscles of the surrounding arteries and dramatically increasing their diameter. Vascular endothelial growth factor is the master regulatory protein that stimulates angiogenesis, the actual sprouting and growth of entirely new capillary networks. When the practitioner finally releases the stretch, the mechanical compression vanishes instantly. The newly dilated, massive arterial vessels unleash a torrential flood of highly oxygenated arterial blood back into the peritendon and the surrounding facial structures. This spectacular rush of reactive hyperemia completely overwhelms the area with oxygen, effectively washing away the accumulated lactic acid and delivering a massive payload of amino acids directly to the diffusion boundaries. But more importantly, the repeated application of this hypoxic stress, followed by hyperemic rushing, forces the body to biologically construct fresh, dense capillary networks surrounding the tendon over time. By literally rebuilding the microvascular infrastructure of the knee, the practitioner permanently solves the root cause of the metabolic starvation and toxic pooling that caused the stiffness in the first place. The tendon is resurrected from a dry, suffocating, acidic state to a highly nourished, oxygen-rich environment where cellular regeneration becomes the default physiological baseline. This profound cardiovascular and hemodynamic adaptation firmly cements the understanding that the isolation of the tibial and patellar tendons is not just about changing the physical length of the tissue, but about fundamentally rewriting the microvascular destiny of the entire joint complex. As we elevate our understanding of this regenerative process, we must also address the profound implications of biomechanical alignment and kinetic chain integration. The knee is often described as a joint heavily dictated by the biomechanical realities of the joints immediately above and below it, specifically the hip and the ankle. In the elderly population, chronic restriction in ankle dorsiflexion, often due to highly fibrotic Achilles tendons and stiff calf musculature, completely disrupts normal walking mechanics. When the ankle fails to yield and absorb impact, the immense ground reaction forces are immediately shunted upstream, violently crashing into the knee joint. Similarly, a lack of extension in the hip joint, caused by chronically shortened hip flexors from decades of prolonged sitting, alters the pelvic tilt and forces the femur into abnormal internal rotation. This rotation creates a disastrous valgus collapse at the knee, placing asymmetrical, shear stress across the patellar tendon and the delicate menisci. If one attempts to utilize the seated stretching protocol to restore the elasticity of the knee while completely ignoring the pathological restrictions locked within the hips and ankles, the results while initially promising, will invariably be transient. The newly elasticized patellar tendon will immediately be subjected to the same destructive, asymmetrical shearing forces the moment the individual begins to walk, rapidly reinitiating the cascade of inflammation, lactic acid accumulation, and fibrotic stiffening. Therefore, achieving true, enduring structural independence necessitates a holistic, systemic application of these stretching principles across the entire lower kinetic chain. The seated protocol targeting the knee must be seamlessly integrated with equally sophisticated static isolation techniques dedicated to releasing the dense facial layers of the calves, ankles, and the deep iliopsoas complex of the hips. Only by liberating the entire biological suspension system can the knee joint function precisely as evolution intended, operating as a perfectly aligned, frictionless hinge that seamlessly transfers kinetic energy without localized wear and tear. This systemic biomechanical approach also deeply influences the proprioceptive mapping within the somatosensory cortex of the brain. Proprioception, the body's innate, subconscious awareness of its position in space, is heavily reliant on the continuous stream of sensory data firing from the mechanoreceptors embedded within the joint capsules, ligaments, and fascia. In a stiff, fibrotic, lactic acid-soaked knee, these vital mechanoreceptors become biologically muffled, transmitting degraded, inaccurate, or entirely silent signals back to the central nervous system. This catastrophic loss of proprioceptive acuity is the primary reason why elderly individuals suffer from such a high incidence of devastating falls. Their brain literally loses the precise, real-time map of where their legs are in space. The meticulous, sustained mechanical tension of a seated stretch acts like a massive sensory reset button. By deeply stimulating the dormant mechanoreceptors within the joint capsule, the stretch floods the somatosensory cortex with high-definition, highly accurate sensory data. As the joint fluid is washed out, the lactic acid removed, and the elasticity restored, the mechanoreceptors are liberated from their fibrotic prisons, instantly restoring their ability to transmit clear, rapid signals regarding joint angle, pressure, and velocity. This incredible restoration of high-definition proprioception fundamentally rewires the individual's balance and coordination. The brain regains immediate, precise control over the lower extremities, allowing for highly orchestrated, lightning-fast microcorrections during dynamic movement. The tragic narrative of the fragile, unbalanced older adult is thus rewritten through the profound neurological awakening facilitated by targeted mechanical tension. We must also rigorously evaluate the profoundly negative impact of common pharmacological interventions on the long-term success of this regenerative protocol. The immediate reflexive response of modern medicine to the pain and stiffness of the aging knee is the aggressive prescription of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. While these powerful compounds undeniably offer rapid, transient relief from the agonizing symptoms by blocking the enzymes responsible for synthesizing inflammatory prostaglandins, they are biologically catastrophic for the actual process of structural regeneration. The inflammatory cascade, highly demonized in mainstream medical discourse, is not an inherently evil process. It is, in fact, the absolute biological prerequisite for tissue healing. The early stages of inflammation following the mechanical signaling of the stretch involve the crucial migration of macrophages to the area. These immune cells are strictly responsible for clearing away the microscopic cellular debris and the degraded, cross-linked collagen fragments broken apart by the stretch. Following this vital cleanup phase, the inflammatory prostaglandins directly stimulate the fibroblasts to proliferate and commence the massive synthesis of new, organized collagen arrays. By chronically suppressing this entire pathway with chemical interventions, the elderly individual completely paralyzes the biological mechanism of healing. The mechanical tension of a seated stretch may successfully break the fibrotic adhesions and initiate the demand for repair, but if the cellular workforce is biochemically handcuffed by anti-inflammatory drugs, the new tissue will simply never be built. The knee will remain in a state of perpetually suppressed decay, forever reliant on the pharmacological crutch, while the underlying structural integrity continues to silently erode. To achieve the profound elasticity and the total elimination of deep-seated stiffness promised by this ancient protocol, one must cultivate a profound psychological and physical tolerance to the mild, highly constructive discomfort of the healing process, firmly rejecting the allure of chemical suppression in favor of authentic biological reconstruction. This demands a massive paradigm shift in how the aging population perceives pain. The aching associated with a stiff, lactic acid-filled joint is a signal of active degeneration, whereas the deep, warm, and often intense sensation experienced during and immediately after a highly effective static isolation stretch is the glorious somatic signature of active regeneration and cellular awakening. Recognizing and deeply embracing this vital distinction empowers the individual to endure the transient discomfort of the protocol with profound confidence, knowing that they are actively participating in the physiological salvation of their own architecture. The complexity of this entire endeavor is further enriched by analyzing the fascinating role of the lymphatic system in the absolute clearance of the metabolic waste. As the synovial washout forcefully expels the toxic, lactic acid-laden fluid from the immediate articular space, this toxic payload does not simply vanish. It must be diligently transported away from the lower extremities and neutralized by the systemic organs. This is the sole responsibility of the lymphatic system, a delicate, low-pressure network of vessels that aggressively relies entirely on muscle contractions, respiratory vacuums, and mechanical pressure differentials to propel its fluid upward against the immense force of gravity. In the heavily sedentary elderly population, the muscular pumps of the calves and thighs are chronically inactive, leading to severe lymphatic stagnation in the lower limbs. The acidic waste extruded from the knee joint by the stretch can easily pool in the surrounding interstitial spaces if the lymphatic system is sluggish, creating a secondary zone of inflammatory irritation and localized edema. Therefore, maximizing the efficacy of the seated stretch requires the active engagement of systemic lymphatic facilitators. The most powerful of these is deep, rigorous diaphragmatic breathing. The human diaphragm is not merely a respiratory muscle. It is the ultimate engine of the lymphatic system. When the diaphragm aggressively contracts and descends deep into the abdominal cavity during a massive inhalation, it creates a profound negative pressure vacuum within the thoracic cavity while simultaneously compressing the major lymphatic reservoirs located in the abdomen. This powerful pressure differential acts like a massive biological siphon, literally sucking the stagnant lymphatic fluid upward from the legs, through the deep inguinal nodes, and rapidly into the general circulation where the lactic acid can finally be processed and eliminated by the liver. By consciously integrating continuous, highly expansive diaphragmatic breathing throughout the entirety of the long, static hold, the practitioner mathematically multiplies the rate of metabolic clearance, ensuring that the toxic waste expelled from the joint is permanently eradicated from the local tissue environment. This seamless fusion of targeted joint isolation, profound neurological modulation, intricate metabolic and nutritional optimization, and rigorous systemic lymphatic activation constitutes a majestic symphony of human physiology. It obliterates the tragic, highly profitable myth that aging must invariably equate to structural decay and permanent pain. The knee joint, with all its staggering biomechanical complexity, is not destined to become a rigid, agonizing burden. Through the disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely consistent application of the traditional seated isolation stretch, governed by a profound respect for the biological laws of mechanotransduction, synovial hydrodynamics, and cellular nutrition, the elderly individual holds the absolute power to rewrite their physical destiny. They possess the inherent biological capability to flush out decades of accumulated lactic acid, painstakingly reconstruct the vital, wave-like architecture of their collagen fibers, and permanently restore the frictionless, spring-like elasticity of their youth. This is not merely an exercise protocol. It is a profound declaration of biological sovereignty, a scientifically unassailable pathway back to the joyous, uninhibited freedom of structural independence. By embracing this deep, physiologically exhaustive paradigm, we illuminate a magnificent future where the golden years of life are characterized not by shrinking horizons and mechanical failure, but by the glorious, boundless resilience of a perfectly revitalized human form. It is the ultimate manifestation of the body's innate, unfathomable drive toward healing, proving forever that structural youthfulness is not dictated by the passage of time, but by the precise, unwavering application of the correct biological stimuli. The mastery of this knowledge empowers generations to reclaim their mobility, transforming the narrative of aging into a triumphant testament to the enduring, regenerative brilliance of the human machine. The relentless pursuit of this physiological truth demands a relentless commitment to practice, an unwavering belief in the body's adaptive capabilities, and a profound understanding of the magnificent internal ecosystem that orchestrates the dance of human movement. Every perfectly executed static hold is a biochemical victory, a powerful mechanical command that overrides the whispers of decay, echoing through the intricate facial webs and the deep articular spaces, awakening the dormant cellular builders, and ultimately securing the profound, enduring joy of a life lived in motion. The science is absolute, the mechanisms are undeniable, and the path to total structural freedom stands brilliantly illuminated for all who possess the discipline to walk it. The eradication of lactic acid, the triumphant return of viscoelasticity, and the ultimate conquering of joint stiffness are the glorious, inevitable rewards for those who harness the ancient wisdom of isolated tension and marry it to the breathtaking complexity of modern physiological science. This is the final, definitive answer to the aging knee, a paradigm of complete and utter restoration that forever banishes the specter of immobility and guarantees a lifetime of powerful, unconstrained, and beautiful structural independence.